The dusty projector hummed to life for the first time in 30 years, casting an eerie blue glow across the abandoned classroom of Escuela Preparatoria Benito Juárez in Guadalajara, Mexico. Maria González, the school's current principal, had discovered the forgotten device while cleaning out storage room 7B in preparation for the school's demolition. What she didn't expect was that when she pressed the power button, the projector would begin playing footage that had been trapped inside its mechanical memory for 3 decades. Footage that would finally provide answers to one of Mexico's most haunting, unsolved mysteries. It was October 15th, 2022, exactly 30 years to the day since 14 bright, promising students had vanished without a trace during the school's annual science fair. Maria watched in stunned silence as grainy images flickered across the makeshift screen she had improvised using a white bedsheet. The timestamp in the corner read, October 15th, 1992, 3:47 p.m., just minutes before the students were last seen alive. The footage showed the school's main auditorium decorated with colorful banners and science project displays. Students in their crisp white uniforms moved excitedly between booths, their voices creating a cheerful buzz that seemed impossible given what Maria knew was about to happen. She recognized the layout immediately, though the auditorium had been renovated twice since 1992. The same stage where she now held assemblies, the same windows that let in the afternoon Mexican sun, the same tile floors that had witnessed both triumph and tragedy. But as Maria continued watching, something in the footage began to feel wrong. The students' movements seemed too coordinated, too purposeful. Their expressions, when the camera caught them clearly, held an intensity that seemed inappropriate for a high school science fair. And then, at timestamp 3:52 p.m., she saw them, the 14 students who would soon disappear forever, gathered around a project display in the far corner of the auditorium. The group consisted of 7 boys and 7 girls, all between the ages of 16 and 18, representing the top academic performers from each grade level. They had been selected to present a special collaborative project titled Temporal Displacement Theory, a practical approach to fourth-dimensional physics. The project had been supervised by Dr. Eduardo Vasquez, the school's physics teacher, who had himself vanished along with the students that fateful afternoon. Maria had read the case files countless times since becoming principal 5 years earlier. The disappearance of the 14 students had rocked not just the school, but the entire city of Guadalajara. These weren't troubled teenagers running away from home. They were honor students from good families, with bright futures ahead of them. The investigation had consumed the Mexican Federal Police for months, generated international media attention, and spawned countless conspiracy theories that persisted to this day. In the footage, Maria could see Dr. Vasquez standing behind the group of students, his tall frame and distinctive beard making him easily recognizable even in the grainy recording. He appeared to be giving instructions, gesturing toward their project display with an enthusiasm that seemed almost manic. The students listened intently, nodding in unison as if they were receiving orders rather than guidance for a science presentation. The project itself was partially visible in the frame, a complex arrangement of mirrors, crystals, and electronic equipment that looked far too sophisticated for a high school science fair. There were cables running in intricate patterns across multiple tables, connecting devices that Maria couldn't identify. At the center of the setup was what appeared to be a large metallic sphere, perfectly smooth and reflective, suspended above the tables by a system of magnetic levitation that defied easy explanation. As the timestamp approached 4 p.m., the footage became increasingly disturbing. The students' movements became more synchronized, almost robotic. Other students and parents in the auditorium seemed oblivious to what was happening in the corner, continuing their normal fair activities while something extraordinary and potentially dangerous was unfolding just meters away. Dr. Vasquez began manipulating controls on a device that looked like a combination of computer terminal and mixing board. The metallic sphere started to rotate slowly, and even through the poor audio quality of the 30-year-old recording, Maria could hear a low humming sound that seemed to resonate through the entire auditorium. The 14 students formed a perfect circle around the sphere, holding hands in a formation that looked more ritualistic than scientific. Then, at exactly 4:03 p.m., something happened that made Maria's blood run cold. The sphere began to emit a bright, pulsating light that caused the camera to overexpose, washing out most of the image in brilliant white. When the exposure adjusted a few seconds later, the circle where the 14 students had been standing was empty. Dr. Vasquez was gone too. The project display remained, but every human being associated with it had simply vanished. The most chilling part was the reaction, or lack thereof, from everyone else in the auditorium. The other students, parents, and teachers continued their activities as if nothing had happened. Some even walked through the area where the students had been standing moments before, apparently oblivious to the fact that 15 people had just disappeared into thin air. It was as if the vanishing had created some kind of localized amnesia, affecting everyone except the camera that had been recording from across the room. Maria paused the footage and sat in the dusty chair, her mind racing to process what she had just witnessed. For 30 years, investigators had found no evidence of what happened to the students. No bodies were ever discovered, no ransom demands were made, no witnesses came forward with useful information. The case had been officially classified as unknown disappearance and had remained open but inactive since 1995. The official investigation had focused on conventional explanations: kidnapping, human trafficking, even the possibility that the students had been recruited by a cult. Dr. Vasquez had been investigated extensively as a potential perpetrator, but his background check revealed nothing suspicious. He was a respected physicist who had taught at the school for 8 years, had published several papers in academic journals, and had no criminal record or history of inappropriate behavior with students. The families of the missing students had never given up hope. Maria knew that several of them still lived in Guadalajara, now in their 70s and 80s, still waiting for answers about what happened to their children. Parents who had watched their bright, ambitious teenagers leave for school that morning and never saw them again. Siblings who had grown up in the shadow of their missing brother or sister, families torn apart by grief and uncertainty. Over the years, various theories had emerged to explain the disappearance. Some investigators suspected that Dr. Vasquez had been recruited by a foreign government to defect with his most promising students, possibly to work on classified research projects. Others believed the students had been victims of organized crime, kidnapped for their intelligence and forced to work for criminal organizations developing sophisticated technologies. The most persistent theory, however, was that the disappearance was connected to Dr. Vasquez's research into theoretical physics. Colleagues at the Universidad de Guadalajara, where he had been completing his doctorate, confirmed that he had been working on highly unconventional theories about time and space manipulation. His dissertation proposal, titled Practical Applications of Temporal Displacement in Educational Settings, had been rejected by the university's physics department as scientifically unsound and potentially dangerous. But what Maria had just seen in the footage suggested that Dr. Vasquez's theories might not have been as unsound as the academic establishment believed. The metallic sphere, the complex electronic setup, the synchronized behavior of the students, it all pointed to something far more extraordinary than a simple kidnapping or defection. She rewound the footage to 3:47 p.m. and watched it again, this time focusing on details she had missed during the first viewing. The other students and adults in the auditorium moved normally, but there was something different about the 14 selected students even before they gathered around the project. They moved with a purpose and coordination that suggested they knew exactly what was going to happen and what their role would be. In the background of the footage, Maria could see parents and younger students examining other science projects. Volcano models, plant growth experiments, simple chemistry demonstrations. The contrast between these typical high school projects and the sophisticated apparatus in the corner was stark. It was as if two completely different events were happening simultaneously in the same space. As she continued analyzing the footage, Maria began to notice other anomalies. The lighting in the corner where the students gathered seemed different from the rest of the auditorium, more intense and with a bluish tint that didn't match the fluorescent lights elsewhere. The electronic equipment on their tables appeared to be powered, with indicator lights and digital displays visible even from across the room, but there were no visible power cables connecting to wall outlets. Most disturbing of all was the behavior of Dr. Vasquez in the minutes leading up to the disappearance. His movements became increasingly erratic, and he seemed to be speaking constantly to the students, though his words were inaudible over the ambient noise of the fair. His gestures became more animated, almost desperate, as if he was trying to convince them of something or prepare them for what was about to happen. The timestamp showed 3:58 p.m. when Dr. Vasquez suddenly stopped speaking and looked directly at the camera that was recording the event. For just a moment, his eyes seemed to lock onto the lens from across the room, and his expression changed to one of profound sadness mixed with determination. He appeared to mouth words that looked like, "I'm sorry," before turning back to the students and beginning the final sequence that would make them all disappear. Maria felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the implications of that moment. Dr. Vasquez had known he was being recorded. He had known that whatever he was about to do would be captured on film. Had he wanted there to be evidence of what happened? Was the footage intended as some kind of message or explanation for future investigators? She fast-forwarded through the remaining footage, watching the aftermath of the disappearance. The fair continued for another hour before someone, Maria couldn't identify who from the footage, apparently noticed that the students and Dr. Vasquez were missing. The first signs of concern appeared around 5:15 p.m., when parents began looking for their children to take them home. The initial assumption was that the group had stepped outside or moved to another part of the school building. It wasn't until 6:30 p.m. when a systematic search of the entire school complex found no trace of the missing 15 people that authorities were contacted. The police arrived at 7:45 p.m. and immediately secured the area, but by then dozens of people had walked through the space where the disappearance had occurred, potentially contaminating evidence. The footage ended abruptly at 8:23 p.m., apparently when someone turned off the camera or removed the recording media. The final frames showed police officers examining the abandoned project display, their flashlights illuminating the complex arrangement of mirrors and electronics that the students had spent weeks assembling under Dr. Vasquez's guidance. Maria ejected the film cartridge from the projector and examined it carefully. It was a standard 16mm educational film reel, the type commonly used in schools throughout the 1990s for recording events and creating documentary materials. The label on the side was handwritten in faded ink. Science Fair 1992, Educational Documentation, property of Dr. E. Vasquez. The fact that the footage had been labeled by Dr. Vasquez himself suggested that he had planned to document the event. But why? And why had the film remained in the projector, forgotten in a storage room for 30 years? Had Dr. Vasquez hidden it deliberately, knowing that it contained evidence that would be needed decades later? Maria's hands trembled as she realized she was holding the first concrete evidence of what had actually happened on October 15th, 1992. For 3 decades, investigators had worked with witness statements, physical evidence from the scene, and endless speculation. Now, for the first time, there was visual documentation of the actual moment when 14 students and their teacher had vanished from existence. But the footage raised more questions than it answered. The sophisticated equipment, the synchronized behavior of the students, the apparent manipulation of space and time, none of it fit with any conventional explanation for their disappearance. If anything, the evidence supported the most outlandish theories that had been dismissed by serious investigators as science fiction. As the afternoon sun began to set through the dusty windows of the abandoned classroom, Maria made a decision that would change her life forever. She carefully packaged the film reel and picked up her phone to call Detective Carlos Mendoza, the original lead investigator on the case. Mendoza had retired 5 years earlier, but had never stopped thinking about the missing students. If anyone deserved to see this footage first, it was the man who had dedicated the better part of his career to finding answers. "Detective Mendoza," she said when he answered, "this is Maria Gonzalez from Preparatoria Benito Juarez. I need you to come to the school immediately. I found something about the missing students from 1992. Something that changes everything." There was a long pause before Mendoza responded. "Are you certain about this, Principal Gonzalez? After 30 years, I've learned to be skeptical of new leads." "Detective," Maria said, looking at the projector that had preserved its secret for 3 decades. "I have footage of the exact moment they disappeared, and I think you're going to find it impossible to believe." Within an hour, Detective Mendoza arrived at the school accompanied by Dr. Patricia Ruiz, a physicist from the Universidad de Guadalajara who had consulted on the original investigation. Dr. Ruiz had been a colleague of Dr. Vasquez and had spent years trying to understand his theoretical work and its possible connection to the disappearance. "Where did you find this?" Mendoza asked, as Maria led them to the storage room where the projector sat waiting. "I was cleaning out rooms for the demolition next month," Maria explained. "This projector was buried under boxes of old textbooks and supplies. When I plugged it in to test if it worked, it automatically started playing the film that was already loaded inside." Dr. Ruiz examined the projector with scientific interest. "This is a Kodak Pageant 16mm projector, probably from the late 1980s. They were standard equipment in schools during that period. If film was left inside for 30 years, it's remarkable that it's still playable. The climate in storage rooms can be very damaging to photographic materials." "The storage room was climate-controlled," Maria explained. "It was originally designed as an archive for important school records. The projector was probably placed there for safekeeping and then forgotten when staff changes occurred. Detective Mendoza was already setting up the projector for another viewing." "Dr. Ruiz, I want you to pay particular attention to the equipment the students were using. You knew Dr. Vasquez's work better than anyone. Can you identify what they were attempting to do?" As the footage began playing again, Dr. Ruiz watched with growing amazement and concern. "This equipment, it's far more sophisticated than anything Eduardo should have had access to in 1992. Some of these devices appear to be using technologies that weren't available to civilian researchers at that time." "What kind of technologies?" Mendoza asked. "Magnetic levitation, for one thing. The way that sphere is suspended suggests the use of superconducting magnets, which required extremely expensive cooling systems in 1992. And those electronic controls, they look more like modern computer interfaces than anything that existed 30 years ago." As they watched the students form their circle around the sphere, Dr. Ruiz became increasingly agitated. "This is wrong," she muttered. "Eduardo was brilliant, but he wasn't reckless. He would never have attempted something like this with students present. The theoretical risks alone." "What kind of risks?" Maria asked. Dr. Ruiz paused the footage at the moment when the sphere began to emit its brilliant light. Eduardo's research focused on temporal displacement, essentially the theoretical possibility of moving objects through time rather than space. His calculations suggested that under specific conditions, it might be possible to create localized distortions in the space-time continuum. "You're talking about time travel," Detective Mendoza said flatly. "I'm talking about theoretical physics that most scientists considered impossible," Dr. Ruiz replied. "But if Eduardo had somehow obtained the necessary technology and power sources, and if his calculations were correct rather than delusional—" She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. The 14 students hadn't been kidnapped or murdered. They had been displaced in time, transported to some other moment in history through a scientific experiment that had gone far beyond the boundaries of responsible research. As the footage reached the moment of disappearance, all 3 viewers watched in stunned silence. The brilliant light, the empty space where 15 people had been standing, the complete lack of reaction from other people in the auditorium. It defied every rational explanation except the one that Dr. Ruiz was reluctantly considering. "If this is real," Detective Mendoza said slowly, "then we've been investigating the wrong crime for 30 years. These students weren't victims of kidnapping. They were victims of a scientific experiment that displaced them through time." But displaced them to when?" Maria asked. "Are they in the past, the future? Are they still alive somewhere, or did the experiment kill them?" Dr. Ruiz was studying the frozen image of the brilliant light emanating from the sphere. Eduardo's theoretical work suggested that temporal displacement would be bidirectional, that subjects could be moved forward or backward in time, and that with the proper calculations they could potentially be returned to their original temporal position. "Are you saying they might still be alive?" Detective Mendoza asked. "I'm saying that if Eduardo's theories were correct, and if this experiment was successful rather than catastrophic, then the students might exist in some other time period, waiting for the conditions to be recreated that would allow them to return." The 3 of them sat in silence, contemplating the staggering implications of what they had discovered. After 30 years of conventional investigation, the truth appeared to be something that challenged the very foundations of scientific understanding. But if Dr. Ruiz was correct, then the discovery of this footage was only the beginning. If the students had been displaced through time rather than destroyed, then somewhere in the flow of history, 14 teenagers and their teacher were waiting to be found, or waiting for the opportunity to return home. Detective Mendoza looked at the projector that had preserved this impossible secret for 3 decades. "Dr. Ruiz, I need you to analyze every frame of this footage. I need to understand exactly what Dr. Vasquez was attempting to do, and whether there's any possibility that it can be reversed. And I need to contact the families," Maria added. "They deserve to know that their children didn't simply vanish. They were taken somewhere, and there might be a way to bring them back." As the sun set over Guadalajara, casting long shadows through the abandoned classroom, the 3 investigators began the process of unraveling a mystery that would challenge everything they thought they knew about science, time, and the fate of 14 missing students who had disappeared into the impossible. Dr. Patricia Ruiz hadn't slept in 3 days. Since viewing the footage of her former colleague's impossible experiment, she had been consumed by the need to understand how Eduardo Vasquez had achieved what appeared to be actual temporal displacement. Her office at the Universidad de Guadalajara had become a war room, with whiteboards covered in equations, stacks of physics journals dating back to the 1980s, and printouts of every frame from the 30-year-old film. "Patricia, you need to rest," her research assistant Miguel Santos said as he brought her another cup of coffee. "You've been here since Tuesday." "Miguel, you don't understand," Dr. Ruiz replied, not looking up from the complex mathematical calculations she was working through. If Eduardo really achieved temporal displacement in 1992, then everything we thought we knew about the limitations of current technology is wrong. Either he had access to resources that shouldn't have existed, or he made a breakthrough that was decades ahead of its time. Detective Mendoza arrived at the university that Friday morning with a thick folder of documents he had retrieved from storage. The original investigation files contained details that had seemed irrelevant 30 years ago, but now took on new significance in light of the footage. Dr. Ruiz, I've found some things that might interest you. He spread several photographs across her desk, images of the equipment that had been left behind after the students disappeared. The investigation team catalogued everything at the scene, but they didn't know what they were looking at. To them, it was just electronic equipment, but now that we know what Eduardo was attempting... Dr. Ruiz examined the photographs with the trained eye of a physicist. "This is remarkable," she said, pointing to an image of the metallic sphere. "This appears to be made of an alloy I don't recognize. And these magnetic levitation coils. The design is far more sophisticated than anything that was commercially available in 1992. "That's what I was hoping you'd say," Detective Mendoza replied, "because it supports a theory I've been developing. I don't think Eduardo built this equipment himself. I think he had help, possibly from sources outside Mexico." Over the next several hours, Dr. Ruiz and Detective Mendoza pieced together a timeline of Dr. Vasquez's activities in the months leading up to the disappearance. The investigation revealed a pattern of unusual behavior that had been overlooked during the original case. In January 1992, Dr. Vasquez had taken an unexplained leave of absence from the school, claiming he needed to attend a conference in Europe. However, immigration records showed no evidence of him leaving Mexico during that period. When he returned 3 weeks later, colleagues noted that he seemed different, more excited, more secretive, and apparently in possession of financial resources he hadn't had before. His bank records from 1992 show 3 large deposits totaling 2.3 million pesos, Detective Mendoza explained. That's equivalent to about $400,000 at the time. Far more money than a high school physics teacher should have had access to. "Where did the money come from?" Dr. Ruiz asked. "That's where it gets interesting. The deposits were made through international wire transfers, but the source accounts were traced to shell companies that no longer exist. Whoever was funding Eduardo's work went to great lengths to hide their identity." Dr. Ruiz found this information deeply disturbing. Eduardo was passionate about theoretical physics, but he was also naive about the potential dangers of his research. If someone with resources and questionable motives was backing his experiments, then the 14 students might have been test subjects rather than volunteers, Detective Mendoza finished, which means what happened to them might not have been an accident. Their investigation took a dramatic turn when Miguel Santos, working late in the university's archives, discovered a hidden cache of documents in Dr. Vasquez's former office. The office had been sealed after his disappearance and converted to storage space, but Miguel found that one of the filing cabinets had a false bottom containing dozens of research papers, technical diagrams, and correspondence that had never been discovered during the original investigation. "Dr. Ruiz, you need to see this," Miguel said, bursting into her office with a manila envelope. "I found Eduardo's real research notes, the ones he kept hidden from the university." Nande, the documents painted a picture of a scientist who had become obsessed with proving his temporal displacement theories at any cost. His private notes, written in a mixture of Spanish and English, revealed that he had been in contact with researchers from several countries who were working on similar projects. One letter, dated August 15, 1992, was particularly revealing. Eduardo, The Moscow team has achieved preliminary success with small organic specimens. Displacement window of 3. 7 seconds confirmed. Berlin group reports similar results with crystalline structures. Your proposal for human testing is premature and dangerous, but we understand your urgency. If you proceed, use the modified resonance frequencies we discussed. Remember, the return trajectory must be calculated before displacement begins. KB. Moscow team? Berlin group? Dr. Ruiz read the letter aloud with growing alarm. Eduardo was part of some kind of international research consortium, and they were planning human experiments. Detective Mendoza studied the letter carefully. The timing is significant. This letter was written just 2 months before the disappearance. Someone was pushing Eduardo to move forward with human testing, despite acknowledging that it was dangerous. As they continued examining the hidden documents, a disturbing picture emerged. Dr. Vasquez had been recruited by an international group of researchers who were secretly working on temporal displacement technology. The project appeared to be funded by private sources rather than government agencies, and the participants were operating outside normal academic and ethical oversight. The technical diagrams found in the cache showed that the equipment used in the experiment was far more complex than it had appeared in the footage. The metallic sphere was actually the visible component of a much larger system that included underground electromagnetic coils, precisely tuned crystalline resonators, and a power source that Dr. Ruiz couldn't identify from the specifications. "Look at this power consumption calculation," she said, pointing to a handwritten note in the margin of one diagram. Eduardo's equipment was drawing nearly 50 megawatts during the displacement event. That's enough electricity to power a small city. There's no way the school's electrical system could have provided that much power. Then where was the power coming from? Detective Mendoza asked. Dr. Ruiz studied the diagrams more carefully. According to these notes, they installed an underground power system that tapped directly into the city's electrical grid through an illegal connection. The power draw was carefully timed to coincide with peak usage periods when the additional drain wouldn't be noticed by utility monitoring systems. The revelation that Dr. Vasquez and his collaborators had been operating an illegal high-energy physics experiment in a high school explained many of the anomalies that had puzzled investigators for 30 years. The sophisticated equipment, the massive financial resources, the secretive behavior, it all pointed to a project that was far larger and more dangerous than anyone had realized. But the most disturbing discovery came when Miguel found a series of photographs hidden at the bottom of the document cache. The images showed the same 14 students who had disappeared, but they were taken weeks before the science fair. In the photos, the students were working with the temporal displacement equipment in what appeared to be a basement laboratory. These students weren't randomly selected for the experiment, Dr. Ruiz realized. They were recruited and trained specifically for this purpose. Eduardo had been preparing them for months. Detective Mendoza examined the photographs with growing anger. These kids had no idea what they were getting into. Look at their faces. They're excited. They think they're part of some special advanced science program. They trusted their teacher, and he led them into an experiment that could have killed them. The photographs revealed details about the students' preparation that were both fascinating and horrifying. They had been trained to operate specific pieces of equipment, to stand in precise positions relative to the temporal displacement field, and to follow complex timing sequences that would synchronize their actions with the activation of the machinery. One photograph showed Dr. Vasquez demonstrating the hand-holding formation that the students would later use during the actual experiment. His notes indicated that the human circle was designed to create a biological resonance field that would interact with the electromagnetic forces generated by the equipment. He was using the students as components in his machine, Dr. Ruiz said with disgust. Their bodies were part of the temporal displacement mechanism. That's why the experiment required exactly 14 subjects. The specific number was calculated to create the proper resonance frequency. As they continued studying the hidden research, Dr. Ruiz began to understand the theoretical basis for Dr. Vasquez's experiment. His approach combined elements of quantum mechanics, electromagnetic field theory, and biological systems in ways that mainstream physics had never attempted. The human nervous system generates weak electromagnetic fields, she explained to Detective Mendoza. Eduardo's theory was that these biological fields could be amplified and synchronized with artificial electromagnetic pulses to create what he called temporal resonance windows. If his calculations were correct, objects within the resonance field would become temporarily disconnected from normal space-time. But temporarily disconnected to where? Detective Mendoza asked. The students didn't just become invisible, they completely disappeared. Where did they go? Dr. Ruiz found the answer in a research paper titled Temporal Displacement Trajectories and Return Protocols. According to Dr. Vasquez's calculations, subjects exposed to temporal displacement would be moved along what he called probability streams within the space-time continuum. Depending on the specific resonance frequencies used, they could be displaced forward or backward in time by periods ranging from minutes to decades. The terrifying part, Dr. Ruiz realized, is that Eduardo's notes indicate the students weren't displaced randomly. The experiment was designed to move them to a specific time period, October 15th, 2022, exactly 30 years in the future. Detective Mendoza stared at her in shock. You're saying they're supposed to return today, that the experiment was designed to bring them back after 30 years? According to these calculations, yes. But there's a critical problem. The return process requires the same equipment and power levels that were used for the original displacement. Without that, the students would remain trapped in 2022 with no way to return to their original time period. The implications of this discovery were staggering. If Dr. Vasquez's theories were correct, then somewhere in Guadalajara, 14 students who had disappeared 30 years ago were about to materialize in the present day. But without the proper equipment to receive them, their return could be catastrophic. We need to contact the authorities immediately, Detective Mendoza said. If these students are about to reappear, we need to be ready for them. But Dr. Ruiz was studying another set of calculations that made her blood run cold. Carlos, there's something else. According to Eduardo's notes, the temporal displacement process requires enormous amounts of energy, both for the initial displacement and for the return journey. If the students are displaced back to 2022 without proper controls, what happens? The uncontrolled release of temporal energy could create what Eduardo called a chronological rupture. Essentially, a tear in space-time that could affect the entire region around Guadalajara. We're not just talking about the safety of 14 students, we're talking about a potential catastrophe that could affect millions of people. As the afternoon sun began to set over the Universidad de Guadalajara, Dr. Ruiz and Detective Mendoza realized they were facing a crisis that was far beyond anything they had imagined. The discovery of the footage had seemed like the end of a 30-year mystery, but it was actually the beginning of a countdown to an event that could reshape their understanding of reality itself. We need to find the original equipment, Dr. Ruiz said urgently. If it still exists, if it can be reactivated, we might be able to control the students' return and prevent a chronological disaster. Where would it be? Detective Mendoza asked. The school was searched thoroughly after the disappearance. Dr. Ruiz referred back to the technical diagrams. The underground components were never discovered because no one knew to look for them. According to these specifications, There should be an entire laboratory complex beneath the school, connected to the main building through utility tunnels. Then we need to get back to the school immediately, Detective Mendoza said. If 14 students are about to materialize out of thin air, we need to be ready for them. As they gathered the research documents and prepared to leave the university, Miguel Santos made one final discovery that changed everything. Hidden in the very last folder was a letter addressed to future investigators and sealed with Dr. Vasquez's personal stamp. "Dr. Ruiz," Miguel said, holding up the envelope, "I think Eduardo knew this day would come. I think he left instructions for what to do when the students returned." Dr. Ruiz opened the letter with trembling hands. Inside was a detailed protocol for managing the students' return, written in Dr. Vasquez's careful handwriting, "To whoever finds this letter. If you are reading this, then my experiment has succeeded and the students have returned after 30 years of temporal displacement. I knew that I would not survive the return journey. The biological cost of temporal displacement is too high for extended exposure. But the students were young and strong, and I calculated that they could survive the 30-year journey through time. The underground laboratory remains intact beneath the school. The equipment will reactivate automatically when the temporal displacement field begins to collapse. Your task is to ensure that no one else is in the displacement zone when the students return. The energy release will be significant but contained if the protocols are followed correctly. I accept full responsibility for what I did to those children. I believed that advancing human knowledge justified the risk, but I now understand that I was wrong. Please help them readjust to your time period and tell their families that they have not aged during their journey. They are still the teenagers they were in 1992, but they are returning to a world that has changed beyond their recognition. The future belongs to them now. Help them find their place in it. Dr. Eduardo Vasquez, October 15th, 1992. Dr. Ruiz looked at Detective Mendoza with a mixture of wonder and terror. "Carlos, we're not just investigating a 30-year-old disappearance anymore. We're about to witness the return of 14 students who have traveled through time. And according to Eduardo's calculations, it's going to happen in less than 6 hours." As they raced through the streets of Guadalajara toward Preparatoria Benito Juarez, both investigators wondered whether they were about to witness a scientific miracle or a temporal catastrophe that would change the world forever. The underground laboratory beneath Preparatoria Benito Juarez was exactly where Dr. Vasquez's diagrams indicated it would be. Detective Mendoza and Dr. Ruiz, accompanied by a team of emergency responders and university physicists, accessed the hidden complex through a utility tunnel that connected to the school's basement. What they found defied every expectation they had formed about the scope of the 30-year-old experiment. The laboratory was vast, nearly the size of the school's auditorium above, and filled with equipment that looked more like something from a science fiction film than a 1990s research facility. Massive electromagnetic coils were embedded in the walls and ceiling, their copper windings still gleaming despite 3 decades of abandonment. Banks of computer terminals lined the walls, their screens dark, but their indicator lights blinking in slow, rhythmic patterns that suggested the systems had been running continuously since 1992. "This is impossible," Dr. Ruiz whispered as she examined a control panel covered with switches and displays labeled in multiple languages. The power requirements alone, how did Eduardo hide an operation of this magnitude? Miguel Santos, who had joined the team despite Dr. Ruiz's concerns about bringing a graduate student into such a dangerous situation, was documenting everything with his camera. "Professor, look at these power cables. They're connected to some kind of underground generator. This whole facility is completely independent of the school's electrical system." At the center of the laboratory was a circular platform about 20 feet in diameter, marked with the same geometric patterns they had seen in Dr. Vasquez's research notes. Above the platform, suspended from the ceiling by magnetic levitation, was a metallic sphere identical to the one they had seen in the footage, but much larger, approximately 6 feet in diameter and rotating slowly with an almost hypnotic precision. Detective Mendoza checked his watch. 9:47 p.m., October 15th, 2022. According to Dr. Vasquez's calculations, the students would return at exactly 10:15 p.m., the precise moment when the temporal displacement field would collapse after its 30-year cycle. Dr. Ruiz, we have less than 30 minutes. What do we need to do to prepare for their arrival? Dr. Ruiz was studying a status display that showed the laboratory systems were already beginning their reactivation sequence. It looks like Eduardo programmed everything to activate automatically. The equipment is powering up according to a predetermined schedule. All we need to do is ensure that no one else enters the displacement field when the students materialize. But as the team continued exploring the laboratory, they made a disturbing discovery. Along the walls were 14 alcoves, each containing a hospital bed, equipped with advanced life support systems. The beds were labeled with the names of the missing students, and medical monitors showed vital signs that had been running continuously for 30 years. "What are these?" Detective Mendoza asked, examining the equipment with growing alarm. Dr. Ruiz studied the medical displays and felt her blood run cold. "These are biological monitoring systems. They've been tracking the students' vital signs during their temporal displacement. Look, heartbeats, brain activity, respiratory patterns." Eduardo wasn't just sending them through time blindly. He was monitoring their condition during the entire 30-year journey. The implications were staggering. The students hadn't simply vanished into some temporal void. They had been conscious and alive during their displacement, existing in a parallel time stream while their bodies were monitored by the equipment in the underground laboratory. Dr. Vasquez had essentially kept them in a form of temporal suspended animation, their biological functions maintained by the laboratory systems while their consciousness experienced the passage of 30 years. "But why?" Miguel asked. "Why displace them for exactly 30 years? What was supposed to happen in 2022 that made this worth such an incredible risk?" Dr. Ruiz found the answer in a final set of research notes mounted near the central control console. Dr. Vasquez's plan had been far more ambitious than a simple temporal displacement experiment. He had been attempting to create what he called a temporal anchor, a group of individuals who could serve as living bridges between different time periods. According to his theoretical framework, the students would return to 2022 with their consciousness intact, but with the accumulated experience of having existed in multiple temporal states simultaneously. They would possess knowledge of both 1992 and 2022, making them unique in human history, people who had literally lived through 30 years of time without aging, experiencing the flow of history from a perspective outside normal temporal constraints. He was trying to create temporal observers, Dr. Ruiz realized, people who could provide information about how timeline changes propagate through history. If his calculations were correct, the students would return with memories of multiple possible versions of the 30 years between 1992 and 2022. At 10:05 p.m., the laboratory systems reached full power. The electromagnetic coils embedded in the walls began to hum with increasing intensity, and the suspended sphere started rotating faster, generating a low-frequency vibration that could be felt throughout the complex. The air itself seemed to shimmer with electromagnetic energy, and the temperature in the laboratory began to drop rapidly. "Everyone needs to move to the observation area," Dr. Ruiz announced, indicating a shielded section of the laboratory behind thick glass barriers. When the displacement field collapses, there's going to be a massive energy release. We need to be protected from the electromagnetic pulse. Detective Mendoza was coordinating with the emergency response team via radio. All units, maintain your positions outside the school. We have confirmation that the temporal event will occur in approximately 10 minutes. Under no circumstances should anyone enter the building until we give the all clear. As the countdown continued, Dr. Ruiz noticed something unexpected in the laboratory's systems. Additional displays were activating, showing what appeared to be external monitoring stations throughout Guadalajara. Carlos, look at this. Eduardo didn't just build this laboratory. He installed monitoring equipment throughout the city. He was tracking temporal fluctuations across the entire metropolitan area. The scope of Dr. Vasquez's experiment was far larger than anyone had imagined. He had been monitoring the temporal effects of his experiment on the entire city of Guadalajara for 30 years, collecting data on how the displacement of 14 individuals would ripple through the space-time continuum. The families, friends, and community members who had been affected by the students' disappearance had unknowingly been part of a vast temporal research project. At 10:12 p.m., the laboratory systems reached a critical threshold. The sphere above the central platform began to emit the same brilliant white light they had seen in the 1992 footage, but much more intense. The electromagnetic field became so powerful that metal objects throughout the laboratory began to vibrate, and the overhead lights flickered despite being connected to a separate power system. "It's starting," Dr. Ruiz announced, her voice barely audible over the increasing hum of the machinery. "The temporal displacement field is beginning to collapse. The students should materialize in approximately 3 minutes. Miguel Santos, documenting everything with his camera, suddenly stopped filming. "Professor, look at the biological monitors. The vital signs are changing dramatically." The medical displays showed that the students' heartbeats were accelerating, their brain activity was spiking to unprecedented levels, and their body temperatures were fluctuating wildly. After 30 years of stable, suspended animation, their biological systems were preparing for reintegration with normal space-time. At exactly 10:15 p.m., the sphere above the central platform exploded into a pillar of brilliant light that filled the entire laboratory. The electromagnetic pulse was so powerful that it temporarily disabled the recording equipment, plunging the observation area into darkness except for the blazing column of temporal energy. When the light faded and the emergency lighting restored visibility, 14 figures stood on the central platform, arranged in the same circular formation they had maintained when they disappeared 30 years earlier. But something was wrong. They weren't moving, and their eyes were closed as if they were still unconscious. "Are they alive?" Detective Mendoza asked urgently. Dr. Ruiz was monitoring the biological displays, which showed stable vital signs but unusual brain activity patterns. "They're alive, but they're in some kind of temporal shock. Their consciousness needs time to readjust to linear time flow after existing in a quantum temporal state for 30 years. One by one, the students began to open their eyes and look around the laboratory with expressions of confusion and wonder. They appeared exactly as they had in 1992, 17 and 18 years old, wearing the same clothes they had worn to the science fair, showing no signs of having aged during their temporal journey. The first to speak was Carmen Rodriguez, who had been the valedictorian of her class in 1992. "Dr. Vasquez," she said, her voice confused and frightened. "What happened? Where are we?" Dr. Ruiz stepped forward carefully, staying outside the central platform area in case there were residual temporal effects. "Carmen, my name is Dr. Patricia Ruiz. I was a colleague of Dr. Vasquez. You've been displaced through time for 30 years. Today is October 15th, 2022. The students looked at each other with growing alarm as the reality of their situation began to sink in. Jorge Martinez, who had been the youngest member of the group at 16, started to cry. 30 years! That's impossible. It feels like we were just at the science fair. Where is Dr. Vasquez? Dr. Vasquez didn't survive the temporal displacement, Dr. Ruiz explained gently. The biological stress of managing the experiment while being displaced himself was too great, but he left detailed instructions for your return. He wanted to make sure you would be safe when you came back. Over the next several hours, the students underwent medical examinations that confirmed what Dr. Vasquez's theories had predicted. They had not aged during their displacement. Their bodies were exactly as they had been in 1992, down to the cellular level. However, their minds retained memories of the 30-year journey through time, though these memories were fragmented and difficult to process. It's like having dreams of everything that happened, explained Maria Santos, no relation to Miguel Santos, as she spoke with Dr. Ruiz. I remember seeing things, events, people, changes in the world, but it all feels like it happened to someone else. Like I was watching a movie of the last 30 years instead of living through them. The reunion with their families was both joyful and heartbreaking. Parents, who were now in their 70s and 80s, embraced children who were still teenagers. Siblings who had grown up and had families of their own met brothers and sisters who remembered them as children. The temporal displacement had created a unique form of tragedy. Families torn apart not by death, but by time itself. Carmen Rodriguez's mother, now 89 years old and confined to a wheelchair, wept as she held her daughter, who was still 17. I prayed every day for 30 years that you would come home, she whispered. I never stopped believing. But the students' return also brought complications that no one had anticipated. They possessed detailed knowledge of events from their temporal journey, including information about technological developments, political changes, and social trends that had occurred during their displacement. Their minds contained 30 years of observational data from a perspective outside normal time flow. The students remember everything, Dr. Ruiz explained to Detective Mendoza as they observed the family reunions. They've witnessed the entire technological revolution from the 1990s to the 2020s, but from a temporal perspective that allows them to see the connections and patterns that people living through those changes couldn't perceive. This unique knowledge made the students incredibly valuable to researchers studying historical trends, technological development, and social change. But it also made them targets for governments and corporations who wanted to exploit their temporal observations for commercial or political advantage. We need to protect them, Detective Mendoza realized. These kids have seen 30 years of human development from a perspective that's never existed before. There are going to be a lot of powerful people who want to get their hands on that information. Dr. Ruiz agreed, but she was also concerned about the students' psychological well-being. They're still teenagers emotionally, but they've experienced 30 years of compressed temporal existence. They're going to need specialized counseling to help them integrate their displaced memories with their current reality. Over the following weeks, the students gradually adapted to life in 2022, though the process was far from easy. They had to learn about technologies that hadn't existed in their time. Smartphones, social media, the internet as it had evolved, while dealing with the trauma of having lost 30 years of normal life experience. Some of the students thrived in their new temporal situation. Jorge Martinez, who had always been interested in computer science, was fascinated by the technological developments he had observed during his displacement and quickly became proficient with modern technology. He eventually enrolled in advanced computer science courses at the Universidad de Guadalajara, where his unique temporal perspective gave him insights into technological development patterns that amazed his professors. Others struggled with the psychological complexity of their situation. Carmen Rodriguez found it difficult to form relationships with people her apparent age, since she had the emotional experience of observing 30 years of human development. She felt disconnected from both her teenage peers and the adults she had watched grow up during her displacement. The Mexican government established a special commission to study the students' case and protect them from exploitation. Dr. Ruiz was appointed as the scientific liaison, responsible for documenting their temporal experiences while ensuring their privacy and well-being. What Eduardo did was ethically unforgivable, Dr. Ruiz wrote in her official report. He used 14 children as experimental subjects in a procedure that could have killed them or worse. But the unintended consequence is that these students now possess a form of knowledge that could benefit all of humanity, if we can find a way to help them share it without being exploited for it. The laboratory beneath Preparatoria Benito Juarez was sealed and classified as a national research site. The equipment that had enabled the temporal displacement was too dangerous to be left accessible, but too valuable scientifically to be destroyed. Dr. Ruiz and a select team of physicists began the careful process of studying Dr. Vasquez's technology to understand its capabilities and limitations. 6 months after their return, the 14 students had established new lives that balanced their unique circumstances with their need for normalcy. They formed a close support group, meeting regularly to share their experiences and help each other process their temporal memories. Several of them chose to work with researchers studying temporal physics, contributing their observational data to advance scientific understanding of time travel and its effects on human consciousness. Maria Santos became an advocate for temporal research ethics, working with international organizations to establish guidelines for any future experiments involving human temporal displacement. "What happened to us should never happen to anyone else," she said in her testimony before a United Nations Committee on Scientific Ethics. "But since it did happen, we have a responsibility to make sure the knowledge we gained is used to benefit humanity rather than exploit it." The story of the 14 students who vanished during a science fair in 1992 and returned 30 years later became a landmark case in both physics and human rights law. It demonstrated that time travel was possible, but at costs that made it ethically questionable for human experimentation. It also showed that the human mind was more resilient than anyone had imagined, capable of maintaining consciousness and identity even during extended temporal displacement. As for the projector that had preserved the footage of their disappearance for 30 years, it was installed in a special museum at the Universidad de Guadalajara, where it continues to play the remarkable documentation of the moment when 14 students stepped outside the normal flow of time and returned with knowledge that would help humanity better understand its place in the temporal universe. The students themselves, now adults in chronological age, but forever marked by their temporal journey, continue to contribute to scientific research while building lives that bridge the gap between their 1992 origins and their 2022 reality. They serve as living proof that time is far more flexible than most people believe, and that the human spirit can survive even the most extraordinary disruptions to the fundamental structure of existence. Their story reminds us that scientific advancement must always be balanced with ethical responsibility, and that the greatest discoveries in human history often come at costs that can never be fully calculated until long after the experiments are complete. The 14 students who vanished during a science fair in 1992 returned not just with their lives intact, but with knowledge that will continue to influence human understanding of time, consciousness, and the remarkable resilience of the human spirit for generations to come.